when one sees the way that the Trump administration has dealt with the Iranians while in the middle of negotiation, it really sends one story even to the most trusting, that the United States of America under the Trump administration cannot be trusted. And I hold the view that even the Russians who are involved in negotiations with Ukraine may now think differently. How can we trust an administration who in our very neighborhood have betrayed a power which had agreed to negotiate with them? Can we trust them? The world is now reeling under what the Americans have called Operation Epic Fury. When history is written, it may very well be said that Operation Epic Fury was a solution that is worse than the problem. Worse than the problem because it is an attempt to enforce what is characterized as peace by humiliation. And history is consistent, particularly in the Middle East, that all attempts at enforcing peace by humiliation have failed. The Americans themselves will remember the Camp David Accords, which gave birth to the Nobel Peace Prizes for Anwar al-Sadat and Menachem Begin. They'll remember the 1993 Oslo Accords, which also gave birth to Nobel Peace Prizes for Yasser Arafat, Shimon Peres, and Yitzhak Rabin. And they will also remember what they are now referring to, the Abrahamic Accords of the year 2020 and 2021. All these have been attempts by the American administration, successive American administration, to enforce peace on the terms of Israel. The net effect, of course, is that all those who are involved in the peace processes are humiliated, and any purported peace that is based on humiliation and domination never lasts. Iran is unique in the region, unique that it is the center of the Shia sect of Islam. The majority of the population in the Middle East are Sunnis. And in that sense, there is a sense in which there has always been undercurrents that are informed by what I call political Islam, and I use this term very deliberately. And we will remember that in the 1970s, in the 50s rather, 50s through to the 70s, 60s, and then to the 70s, the Iranian administration by the Pahlavi regime was a regime that was pro-America and pro-West. In 1979, when Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and the patriarchs of the Shia regime took over and created a theocracy, they actually took the view that the state of Israel was illegitimate, and they have never recognized the state of Israel. So there has been this underlying hatred for this administration as an administration whose design is to obliterate Israel from the face of the earth. That is as far as Israel is concerned. But the Americans also have a problem. They have a problem that in 1979, during the Carter administration, the Americans were humiliated in Tehran. And I think from their perspective, there has always been a desire to have war in the narrow sense and in the overall scheme. I listened to the Secretary of State of the United States, Mark Rubio, during the Munich Security Conference in February of 2026, and one could see a person that was talking about a Western world that ought to protect its civilization, almost saying we need to recolonize the world, almost saying we need a war. And it is not lost on me that the Trump administration deliberately renamed the Department of Defense the Department of War. And from that point on, there has always been a desire to have this war. It was exacerbated, of course, when the Israelis, responding to the 7th of October attack, went into Gaza, and the war has been prosecuted in a manner that is unprecedented in the history of the world. What we now see is the accusation against Iran that Iran sponsors terrorism, that Iran sponsors the Houthis, that Iran sponsors Hezbollah, that Iran sponsors ISIS. And all these things are things that in the minds of some are debatable. And some argue that there is an old English saying, if you want to kill a dog, give it a bad name. So Iran has been given a bad name as the sponsor of terrorism. To their credit, the Iranians have always said, yes, we are enriching uranium, and we are enriching uranium for the purpose of ensuring that we have energy, in other words, peaceful means. The International Atomic Energy, under the aegis of the United Nations, has visited Iran on several occasions. And the reports have not demonstrated that uranium has been enriched to weapon grade. But the Americans are not in the business of listening to that. So that in 2025, when the Israelis attacked and for a few days there was a war, the Americans then claimed that they had decimated what was supposed to be the nuclear preparedness of the Iranians. So one would ask, if that happened in the year 2025, why is it that the claim is being made that the Iranians are once again having or exposing themselves as having nuclear capability? But the story has now changed. The story from the Israeli perspective is that if you want permanent peace, then you've got to decimate Iran. You've got to decimate their capacity to produce ballistic missiles, their capacity to produce drones. The Americans are saying we've got to decimate their capacity to produce nuclear device and also capacity to deploy and, of course, produce ballistic missiles and drones. The story has now converged from the Israelis and the Americans. And one can see that when there was an attempt to prosecute war in the year 2025, it was halted very quickly, and the Americans then said, let us begin to negotiate. But it's now clear it was not negotiation in good faith from the side of the Americans. And this must be stated quite categorically. In moments such as this, to be neutral is to be untruthful. Because during the period that they purported to enter into negotiations, what the Americans were doing was to move their military arsenal to the Mediterranean Sea and to the Gulf. And once they were ready, once Abraham Lincoln was ready, once Gerald Ford was ready, without any warning and in the middle of negotiation, you could see the rhetoric. And the rhetoric from the President of the United States was consistent. That in the middle of negotiation, the rhetoric was vitriolic. The rules of negotiation are clear. When you are negotiating in good faith, it is done in silence. It is done in a respectful manner. You don't engage in saber rattling. but saber rattling was the modus operandi of the Americans. And once they felt that they were ready, then of course they launched the attack, which had been planned for a long time because the CIA are now saying that we'd been following the Iranian leader Khamenei for a long time, and we knew where he was, and we supplied this information to the Israelis, and that is why he was eliminated in the manner that he was. And of course, his other aides were eliminated because, in my view, it was assumed that when you hit the head, then everything will disintegrate. And you hit the head in situations where there is also internal discontent and unrest because of the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran for a long time. The economy is on its knees. The currency is on its knees. The people are dissatisfied. And they are being told the reason why you are suffering is because you have this theocracy of individuals who are not interested in your rights. They are not respecting your human rights, and they are also not creating an environment where you can thrive economically. The assumption, in my view, therefore, and this is debatable, was that if you eliminate the supreme leader, Khamenei, then Iran would disintegrate. But history of Iran since 1979 has also been consistent. The administration and the regime is so organized that when you eliminate one, there is a process that produces another. And their conviction to their cause is something that ought not to be underrated. And if you listen to the interviews in the streets of Tehran, a few individuals who are anti-regime are now pro-regime, because you are now humiliating the Iranians as a people. And when you are humiliating a people, then they deal with their internal issues first. The Americans are saying, of course, and Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump has been consistent in saying, this is going to be a short war. But let us define short. It may be short in the sense that within a few weeks, the combatants, particularly the Americans and the Israelis, when they think that they have decimated the Iranians and now they have expanded to Lebanon, they may very well expand to Yemen and other areas, then they will sue for peace and get what they want: humiliation of Iran and having them effectively surrender. The Iranians warned in advance that if you attack us, this is going to be a regional war. And there are many people who are analyzing differently. The Iranians, of course, then said, we are going to hit all your bases, whether they are in Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, or Qatar, we are going to hit them. And they have, with the consequence that the value chain or the supply chain in the world has now been disrupted in a manner that was not anticipated. And I've listened to the arguments by the countries that have been hit at the UN General Security Council, saying that this is indiscriminate. But one can debate. If you lend yourself to be used by my enemy, are you not my enemy? And this is what the Iranians are saying. And as regards Saudi, and I think the Israelis want the Saudis to be involved, the Iranians have come out, it is not us who hit Orascon. This is false flag. It is the Israelis who are trying to hit Riyadh with a view to getting them into the conflict. I believe that will be verified in the near future. But Israel is doing everything and anything to ensure that this war is used to decimate the Iranian people. And what they wanted was to ensure that America was involved. When they did it in 2025, the Americans were not quite involved. Now that the Americans have started losing their young men, now the Americans will be deeply involved. And that is exactly what was in the playbook of Benjamin Netanyahu and the individuals who ran the government from Tel Aviv. As to how it will pan out is a debate. It is a debate, and that is how it legitimizes the debate as to how long the war will be. The conventional war may very well end, but will it end? Will it not breed a new group of individuals whose only reason for survival is that we must ensure that Israel never knows peace? And for the first time in the recent past, we have seen Israel being hit and hit quite effectively in Tel Aviv, in West Jerusalem, in Haifa, in Eilat. And these are things that are also going to generate internal discontent. And I am of the view, and I may be wrong in this regard, that the Israeli government and the administration of Benjamin Netanyahu is now a war economy. They cannot survive for a day, metaphorically speaking, without war. It is in their interest that a war is sustained, because it is only in that way, by externalizing your enemy, that you legitimize your being in power. Because the old saying is, when you are in a crisis, you don't change your leaders. And it must never be lost on us that there is personal existential threat to Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife in terms of prosecution for the activities that they engaged in. So these are factors that are there. I've also seen NATO is also saying that they support this. And there are those who are arguing whether this is true or not, is that there is an attempt by the Trump administration, an attempt by the Benjamin Netanyahu administration to create a rift between the Sunni and the Shia Muslims in that region. And that if you pit the big powers in both factions of Islam, with Tehran and Iran representing the Shia, and the Saudis, on the other hand, representing the Sunni, you'll create an environment where you make your enemies, because the Arabs in their totality, from the Israeli perspective, are their enemies since 1948. And if you get them fighting, then you are in a good situation. You let them fight and you sit pretty. So these are possibly conspiracy theories, but they are theories which can be anchored on the evidence that is available on the ground. For the region, economically, it is a disaster. Countries such as Qatar, that long boasted of having calm and peace, the Emiratis, which boasted of having calm and peace, the Bahrainis, the Omanis, the Kuwaitis, it is no longer business as usual. It is business unusual. When you have your entire fleet grounded in Qatar, Etihad, Qatar, the Emirates, it means that your economy is suffering. Countries are now evacuating, so that the foreigners who have been working in Dubai, if they are evacuated, they'll think again, because they know that this is a war that never ends. I always remember the word that was spoken by one person who was being interviewed in Gaza, and he said, the Mujahideen has a long memory. You may think that the war has ended, but once you have humiliated us, once you have dominated us, or so you think, we of this generation and generations yet to come will only exist for one thing: revenge. And I think that that is what is going to happen. I saw people in South Africa, in different parts of the world, talking about the martyrdom of Khamenei, and he is going to become a symbol. You remember when Osama bin Laden was eliminated, they threw his body into the sea. But Khamenei will be buried, and his burial place, like that of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, will become a shrine which will energize a new generation of young people who will want to ensure that America and Israel and the Western world is attacked. That is the unfortunate situation that has been created by the joint efforts of President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu under what they describe as Operation Epic fury. If I was, as a historian, to write about Donald Trump, I will say one thing, that he is consistently inconsistent. You never know what may happen. Of course, he was on television saying, some people saying, I'll get bored, but I'll not get bored. We are going to ensure that the Iranians are decimated. We are going to ensure that their capacity to produce ballistic missiles and their capacity to enrich uranium and therefore to acquire a military device is completely eliminated. And we are going to ensure that America becomes great again. This great again mantra, which means that you humiliate, you are the policeman of the world, is something that is very dominant on his lips. And you never say never. It is quite possible that when the things get out of control, he may say that the Israelis must think otherwise. And it depends on what happens. Remember that the Americans are going into midterm elections. And although across the aisle, to mean in the Republican and the Democrats, most of the Republicans, particularly the hawks in the Republicans, think that this is a good thing, that it has been prosecuted at the right time. But the Democrats have come out quite strongly to say that this is unconstitutional. I've seen Senator Bernie Sanders coming out and said that the Senate should be recalled back to Washington, D.C. to ensure that America does not engage in an unconstitutional war. At the United Nations, Antonio Guterres has been on record that as saying that what the Americans did, of course, he was a little bit reticent. It didn't come out as clearly as he should, in my view. But he said, why prosecute a war in the middle of negotiations, in the middle of discussions on what ought to be done, at a time when the United Nations is sending inspectors to Iran for purposes of verifying whether they are complying? Why do this? And I believe that the UN Security Council will be summoned. Of course, the UN Security Council will say their piece, then there'll be vetoes and all. But Trump is capable of flipping over, depending on what the domestic situation is. If the midterm elections go against him, as I suspect they will, then he will, of course, think very differently. There are those who have said that he faces imminent impeachment proceedings against him. Because the Americans are now suffering throughout the world. We saw what happened in Islamabad when there was an attack by people who are demonstrating in Pakistan, and the Marines actually fired, and it's debatable as to whether it's the Marines who killed those who were killed. And this is going to happen in quite a number of countries. So America may be great again at home, if that is true, but it's becoming one of the most unpopular nations on earth. And I think many people who think that America should play a positive role in international affairs will say it is time to stop this and rethink. And it's time to stop the Israeli administration from fighting everybody on sight. Because the Israelis are fighting everybody on sight. When you think that the war is now being laser guided to focus on Iran, they are now in Beirut. And before you know it, they'll possibly be in Yemen. Before you know it, they'll possibly be in Jordan. So you cannot fight wars on such fronts. And even your supporters such as the US, the more they begin to suffer casualties and Americans begin to see coffins draped in the flag of the United States of America getting home, they'll begin to say, no, this is a war that is unnecessary. And it is also the reality that they cannot dare put boots on the ground in Tehran. If they do so, they'll suffer the humiliation that they suffered in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. But you can never say never. Trump is capable of doing the about turn, and Netanyahu will be left with only one option: to engage in what is essentially a kamikaze fight against the entire Arab world. The Pahlavi, and I think during the period when there were internal riots, there are suggestions that one of the Pahlavis was actually behind it. And I think it is true. And I think it is elements within the United States of America and elements within Israel who are trying to bring them forth. And remember that Iran is also a divided community, divided in the sense that there are those who, having tasted Western life, do not like the theocracy. And you remember when the young girl was killed or died in prison after she was accused of not having dressed properly, the young people came up. So there are those who think that you can use the old regime by making reference to the old king, the good old days of Shah Reza Pahlavi, and bring them back. So I'm quite certain that efforts are being made. Remember, the Americans said through Trump, we want a regime change. Some even suggested that he knows who will replace Khamenei. So there is this idea that you can parachute in somebody who will then sit in office and become the de facto leader, if not the de jure leader or lawful leader of Iran, and then prop up a regime which does your bidding. And I'm quite certain that these Pahlavis are being re-energized wherever they are and being prepared to be taken to Iran. But I think they are dealing with a different kettle of fish. The administration in Iran is not an administration that you can eliminate in the manner that they think. And if they do that, I think they are in danger of creating something in the nature of a civil war in that part of the world, because there will be resistance. And perhaps that is what they want. We have seen whenever the Americans have been, what is left behind, except in very few cases, is chaos. You saw what they did in other countries. It could be chaotic. And I was thinking to myself, it appears that it is a rite of passage for every American president to kill the leader of a foreign country or to kill somebody. Now, Trump has killed Khamenei, and he's very proud about it. And if you look at the list of his predecessors, they were also proud that they had killed some foreign leader. It's a sad thing, particularly when you hear that some of these leaders also claim to be Christians whose commandments say, thou shalt not kill. And yet it would appear their mantra is, thou shalt kill and boast about it. But I think that the situation is very dicey. The Pahlavis may think that they can come in and occupy what they consider to be an empty seat, but you see what happened. No sooner had the supreme leader Khamenei been executed than the process of his replacement started in earnest, and the stabilization of the chain of command is alive and well. So it is not going to be easy, but it's going to be attempted. Russia is a different kettle of fish. So I think that they know their limits. In terms of nuclear warheads, I think the Russians have more than the Americans and the entire Western world combined. And history is consistent. You cannot deal with Russia the way you are dealing with these other countries, because this is a real power. This is a real military power. In fact, I think the fact that America has entered into the war in Iran jointly with Israel now takes away the moral argument that they had. They can no longer blame Russians, because Russians' argument from where I sit is, number one, the reason why we went into this operation in Ukraine is because there was an existential threat. It is because you promised that you would not have NATO expanding to the east, and for that reason we have a legitimate claim. So the moral argument that the West had against Russia is now gone. In fact, I dare say that moral argument the Chinese are watching very closely, and you never know what they could do with Taiwan, basing on the same ground. There is an existential threat in our neighborhood. We have a duty to do what we call preemptive defense, which is you attack before you are attacked. And remember, President Trump has said, the reason why I took Khamenei is because he attempted to take me out, so I took him out first. So I don't think that they would dare do that. I think what is going to happen when the Americans realize that the war cannot be prosecuted on their own timetable in the not too distant future, they'll now go to the UN and said, can you have us begin to negotiate for peace? Can we have a ceasefire? And let's go into negotiations. And you can see they have already started to say that, but the Iranians have said, no, no negotiations, because negotiations out of this humiliation is effectively surrender. Ultimately, there will be some kind of negotiation, but I think the environment is so poisoned that it's not going to be easy this time round. You know, my own view is that the Third World War will be fought piecemeal. One can actually argue that we are now beginning to see segments of what historians may characterize as the piecemeal fighting of the Third World War, so that you are going to have it in regions. And I dare say that I think that Western civilization, after what happened in the World War II, now needs a war. They need a war because war can renew what is a dying civilization. And you can see this from the rhetoric of the leaders, particularly of the United Kingdom and the leaders of France. The others are a lot more reticent. They are upping their expenditure on defense, and they are getting a lot more involved covertly or overtly in different segments. So once they have dealt with the Middle East, they will have destabilized that region sufficiently to justify reconstruction. And I think their economies need reconstruction. That is number one. Number two, the war is also an economic war. Because if you look at what is happening in the Gulf of Hormuz and the world supply chain, they are also, in my view, trying to starve a country that is emerging as economically very strong like China, so that the Chinese are going to buy oil a lot more expensively, their goods are going to become a lot more expensive, and in my view, that is going to undermine their economy, or so they think. And you can also see an attempt at dividing the world. The recent visit by Prime Minister Modi of India to Israel is an attempt to divide what was seen as an emerging front that is tied together by the BRICS, involving Russia, China, and Brazil, and of course India and South Africa. And one wants to see how India will behave in this kind of arrangement. Of course, Pakistan has its own problems with Afghanistan and is internally rather unstable. But you can see that the world war is being fought in piecemeal in that region. And this is a region that is at the center of the world in terms of the supply chain. You can also see that in Latin America, there is an attempt to destabilize countries there. Cuba is already being starved by the Americans. They now want to take control of the oil fields in Venezuela, which was also a major supplier of oil to the Chinese. They want to take control of the Panama Canal, and they are getting into regimes there. Of course, Venezuela is one such administration. One wants to see what they'll do, because the Brazilians are quite clear that they will not allow themselves to be dominated. And you've seen the Mexicans have also responded to the Cuban situation by way of supporting them in some way. So some kind of low-key war is also going on there. In Africa, you also see the heightening of the conflict, which is a resource-informed conflict in places such as the Democratic Republic of Congo. And for the first time, we are seeing even the Kinshasa administration using drones. And you could see the quid pro quo. Once we saw that the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo was in the Oval Office, and not too long ago, the president of France, Macron, was in the Democratic Republic of Congo signing off minerals and all. And in this region in the month of May in Kenya. The Frank-Afrique meeting will be held in Nairobi, Kenya. So you can see that all this diplomatic toing and froing is something that is beginning to happen. And if you listen to Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, trying to get into the war, that when our assets in Cyprus are threatened, we are not going to sit pretty. In other words, they want to be involved in some way. The head of NATO saying that the prosecution of war against Iran is a war that is necessary for world peace. The mantra is peace, but the Third World War is a creeping war. I think it is creeping very slowly, and it may very well be fought piecemeal, not in the total sense that one anticipates. My only fear is if a country like Israel, which has never declared that it has a nuclear device, but which the world knows as a nuclear device, feels so threatened that it uses a nuclear device against Iran or against Lebanon. That will change the equation. That will change the equation in a dramatic way. And one hopes that we'll not get to that stage, because if we do, then who knows? Only the gods can then predict what will happen. Let me say that, and I may be overthinking in this regard, President Trump was elected by some segments in the United States as this individual who was going to be the savior of Christian values. In the United States, those who are anti-LGBTQ said, yes, this is our man who is going to ensure that we go back to the basic morals. He was this new person who is the protector of Christianity against Islam. That is how he justifies the bombing of Kaduna in Nigeria. These Boko Haram are killing Muslims, and I, Donald Trump, the leader of the free world, I have a duty to protect the world. I'm the new person in the block. I'm your King David. I'm the one who is going to slay the latter-day Goliath. And in that regard, even when he says that I'm changing the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War, he's saying that there is an existential war which must be led by the United States of America. He's saying, not in so many words, America is lucky to have me as their president, because, as he said at one time, what is right is only limited by his sense of morality. You can see that that is a person who has elevated himself to a status where in his mind he is infallible. In his mind, he is the savior of the world. In his mind, he is fulfilling prophecies. In his mind, he is doing what is right. In his mind, as the good Christian that he claims to be, he is creating a new world order which is divinely approved. And the people who stand on his path are people who are only good for one thing, to be eliminated. And when you listen the description that they give Khamenei, they say this is the worst person that has ever lived, and that this administration that was put together in 1979 after the revolution, starting with Khomeini, and this now Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and now Khamenei, is one that should be eliminated. So there is a sense in which this is also seen as the protection of the chosen people. It must be seen that the Israelis are depicting themselves. We are God's very chosen. And when we are God's very chosen, we operate outside the law of the world. And one can dare say that what was known as international law, having been articulated so very well after the World War II in San Francisco under the Charter of the United Nations in 1945, what was then created in Paris in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what was created in 1949, the Geneva Conventions relating to war, are all dead. The United Nations, which was created after the League of Nations as being the body that would ensure that there is no arbitrary use of force without reference to the Security Council, is now neutered. They are only good for one thing, issuing statements which nobody bothers about. So Trump is now the big kahuna, the new King David, if you may, who is dispensing justice. And if you look at the old Bible, whenever they were doing things, they cleared everybody. They cleared men and women and cleared even the animals. And that is exactly what they are doing in Iran. So I'm quite certain that when they sit in the calm of their room, they are saying, ours is a divine mission, and we are going to carry it with the precision of the laser. That is the argument. And to argue with people who believe that they are working for a divine power is not easy. Because in their mind, the thing they call negotiation is actually surrender. The thing they call negotiation is actually doing what they want, not what you think is right. In their minds, might is right. In their mind, what they say, in a manner of speaking, is the gospel truth. And I believe that the duo of Donald J. Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu see themselves in that way. We are the chosen few, although they have chosen themselves. When one sees the way that the Trump administration has dealt with the Iranians while in the middle of negotiation, it really sends one story even to the most trusting, that the United States of America under the Trump administration cannot be trusted. And I hold the view that even the Russians who are involved in negotiations with Ukraine may now think differently. How can we trust an administration who in our very neighborhood have betrayed a power which had agreed to negotiate with them? Can we trust them? Are they not just using these negotiations as a scheme for buying time and sizing us up as to whether they can actually shift military hardware into Ukraine and the neighboring countries so that they can engage us in a real war? I believe that going forward, any negotiations which is brokered by the United States of America is going to suffer from a credibility crisis, even from the most trusting of partners. Of course, President Trump may both publicly and privately tell the Russian administration, but you know you are Russia, you are different. We cannot do the things we do to these other countries. You are different. As to whether the Russians will now accept that that is the case is another debate. I believe that if the Russians now want to greet the United States of America, metaphorically, they will wear gloves. They'll wear gloves because they don't think that they can be trusted, which is sad. But it is sad, and it is sad because it means that diplomacy as we knew it is dying, and that perhaps there is now need for a different kind of diplomacy, that there is now need to rethink even the architecture of the UN as was conceived in 1945. What structure it will take, nobody knows. But there is no doubt in my mind that once again, the rule in the world is that might is right. And that if you have the strength of a giant, you use it like a giant. And the giants are now using it. It is not lost on me that powers such as China are very quiet. Their silence could be subject to interpretation. The Russians have, of course, been very clear in what they have said and what they think about this war against Iran. And I think that they are simply saying, you did the wrong thing. You cannot lead people to a negotiation table, and whilst they are negotiating in good faith, you then beat them up and kill their leader. How do you even come back to the negotiation table? All the people who are negotiating with you, almost all of them, you have killed. What is the guarantee that the new set are also being identified for being slaughtered a few days later? That is the poisoned environment that has now been created by the Trump administration at the behest of the Netanyahu administration in Israel. When I listen to President Trump saying that this war will be over in 4 weeks, he is responding to both a domestic pressure and an external pressure, because the domestic pressure is telling him, you have gotten us into the same situation that we found ourselves in Vietnam, and we know the cost of Vietnam. So from that perspective, he's telling his American audience, no, this is a short exercise which will end in 4 weeks. But unknown to him, he's created a trap for himself. The history of the Middle East, right from the 1960s, is that once you get in there, you never get out. That is the reason why the Middle East has given birth to the largest number of Nobel Prize winners, those who try and think they have got it. That is why over the years you've had the Camp Davids, you have had the Oslo Accords, you've had all these others, the Abrahamic Accords, and he thinks that he will parachute in and get out. It is not going to be easy. And he thinks also, in the larger scheme of things, assuming he's thinking in this way, that we have now seized the Venezuela oil, so we have cut off this oil from the Chinese, who are true economic competitors. Oil will be expensive for them, their goods will become expensive. We have also cut the line from them. They cannot get the oil that they were getting through the Gulf of Hormuz, and therefore we have created a trap for them. But I think he's getting it wrong. The history of the world is that countries have thrived through sanction busting. And there is history to demonstrate that you can only police the world in the manner that you think you can for a long time. And some of the enemies that he has now created, even within the Arab world, or ask them, Saudis are not selling their oil. The Qataris are not selling their gas. The Bahrainis, the Kuwaitis. So even his allies are interested in having this war ended. And my view is that the trap he thinks he has created is a trap that will trap him. And it will trap him in such a manner that he will not even know. It will trap him domestically, it will trap him internationally, and reputationally throughout history. History will not carry his name with glory, because he will have disrupted the international chain in a manner that was unprecedented. Of course, in the short to medium term, we may have the price of oil going up in a very dramatic way, with the consequence that the price of goods and price of commodities, insurance in the world because of the longer routes, and other things will begin to happen. But if you look at the impact of what has been done, he has created more enemies than friends. As I've said before, the solution is worse than the problem, and he will realize that sooner rather than later. And the assumption that even the oil that he is now getting from Venezuela will cushion him for all times is misguided. And let time be the verdict creator in this regard. And time will give a verdict that will demonstrate that the American president thought that he had all the answers. Little did he know that he was creating little traps even for his own country. And the other thing that is not being said, I think that as a result of what is happening, there'll be so many centrifugal forces that even what they call terrorism may spread in the world. as a result of this. Because when you are dealing with one power, you have one chain of command. When you create an environment where different chains of commands are being created through ISIS, through Hezbollah, through the Houthis and others, sleeper cells which exist in different parts of the world may very well be woken up, and to the detriment of the United States of America. Because when we are speaking about Trump, we must remember that he is exposing his country, the United States of America, to danger. The argument or the belief, and I think this is a Netanyahu view, that the only way to weaken the Arab world is to create a divide, and that this is our opportunity. Our opportunity is to ensure that the Sunnis, led by Saudi Arabia, and I'm using the word lead very guardedly, and the Shias, led by the Ayatollahs, need to be fighting. Because when they are fighting, then we can prosecute whatever we want in the Middle East. When they are fighting, then the Israeli state is safe. When they are fighting, we can do whatever we want in Gaza. When they are fighting, there'll be no claim or demand for a Palestinian state. When they are fighting, we are stronger. And I think he may have succeeded in persuading the American administration under Trump that that is the underlying reason why it is necessary to create this environment. And remember, it is very quickly, when there was a report that Saudi oil facility had been hit, the Iranians said, no, it is not us. It is the Israelis who are actually doing this. Whether that is true or not, I do not know. But it is the Israelis who are trying to do that in order to draw the Saudis into the battle. And remember that there are US military assets in Saudi Arabia. And I'm quite certain that the Israelis would want to see ballistic missiles being launched from Saudi Arabia into Tehran and Iran generally. Whether they will succeed is another debate, but I believe that Islamic scholars throughout the world will come up and tell these fellows, let not the Islamic Ummah be divided. So there will be efforts. There may even be success in the short to medium term, but this has also animated Islamic scholars throughout the world, that let us not allow ourselves to be divided by these individuals whose benefit will be that we are divided and we are no longer reading from the same page. I think that is what is going to happen. The world is in an interesting environment. We are in a situation where we can dare say that international law as we knew it is dead, dying, or in intensive care unit. And those who have sent it there are the Americans and the Israelis. It is sad that a world that defined how to resolve conflict in 1945 through the medium of the United Nations has now deviated, and the era of unilateralism, where members, permanent members of the UN, now choose to do what is improper in the name of defense, is a sad thing to behold. And it is sad that it's destabilizing the world. It is sad that it is causing the death of people. It is sad that it is undermining all the instruments that had been created 80 years ago under the aegis of the international community, to which continents like Africa were grafted after they became independent. The time now is to wait and see what will happen. Will the UN rethink what it should look like? Will the UN begin to rethink its institutions such as the International Court of Justice and even the ICC, which appears to have been neutered by the United States of America, courtesy of Israel? Interesting times, sad times, but they are our times.